Well, the Fraser Institute is out with its annual rankings of schools, and I'm sure if you're like most parents, you rush to see how your kid's school was doing. Joining me to talk about this is Joel Westheimer. He's the Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa. Joel, good to see you.
Good to see you, Rick.
Are you a fan of these ratings, these rankings done every year by the Fraser Institute?
I am not, and I'll tell you why. I'm not against standardized testing or indicators of how schools are doing. The problem with the Fraser Institute report is twofold. The first is it's based entirely on two very narrow measures of school performance, which are the ones produced by the EQAO tests here in Ottawa and in Ontario. And those tests only measure the performance on those standardized tests in math and literacy. And what goes on in schools is so much broader than that, that gives us our first problem. The second problem is the methodology that the Fraser Institute uses itself is deeply flawed. And so what we end up with is, you and I were talking about any parent, and me included, would jump at any opportunity to say, hey, is my kid's school a 9.8 or a 7.3? And that's great if those numbers were meaningful. But the problem here is that those numbers are only one very small data point in an otherwise very complicated system of assessing schools.
But I assume that they're the only data points available. So it's not like the Fraser Institute is ignoring other data that would offer maybe a deeper and perhaps more credible ranking.
Not really. We could say when you're choosing a doctor for your child, there are no newspaper articles publishing the rankings of doctors in Ottawa and giving them from 100 to 0, and so you go to 100. What you do is you go in, you meet the doctor, you see how they, what they think they're doing. You talk to other people who've had that doctor, and you make an informed decision because we know that doctors are professionals and act in a professional manner. The same should be true for schools and for teachers. Everyone knows when they walk into a school building some of the signs of what makes a good and vibrant school community, and relying on these numbers is just not the way to go.
I suspect there are listeners in our audience who say it'd be pretty good if we could rank doctors.
Well,
I'm not sure what data points you would use, but why not?
Well, exactly. That's the problem, is you don't know what data points to use because people, if we want to rank stocks, we know what data points to use because it's how much money they make, right? Have they gone up or have they gone down? Human beings don't go up and down like that. They're very complex, and the goals for schools are very complex. So do we want kids to know how to read and write? Of course. Do we want them to know how to add numbers? Of course. Do we also want them to develop healthy relationships, to know how to be in a community, to think creatively, to think critically, and to know how to analyze information? We do, and none of those things are measured by the standardized tests, and none of those go into the rankings by the Fraser Report.
Okay, but in the absence of some means to measure what you're talking about, measuring how kids performed on the same test for literacy and math seems pretty good.
Well, let me tell you a little fable. There's someone standing on a street corner, and he's on his knees, and he's looking around in the dark, and someone comes over and says, well, what happened? Can I help you? And he says, yeah, I lost my keys. So they both start looking, and they look for 10 minutes, and then finally the guy says, the woman who comes over to help says, are you sure you dropped your keys here on this corner? And the guy says, no, I dropped them over there on the other corner. And she says, well, why are we looking here? And he says, because the street light is here. So what we're talking about is the Fraser Institute is a streetlight on the wrong place. It's shining a spotlight on something so narrow and so inconsequential in the overall performance of a school that we don't get much information from it. Furthermore, you're right, Rick. I hear what you're saying, that of course the performance on these standardized tests in math and literacy means something. And I'm not saying that the tests are useless. They give you one data point. But when you say, is one data point worse than nothing at all, that's where I'm not so sure, because the data point is not informative enough. And in fact, that data point we already know from other things. For example, some people joke about you can count the number of Volvos in the driveway in the homes around the school because the correlation between performance on those tests and the level of wealth in the neighborhood is almost 1-to-1. So it's not very consequential data, and it's not the one we should be paying attention to. I would much rather see parents go into a school, look at what's on the walls, talk to the teachers, talk to other parents who've had kids in that school, and make an informed opinion for themselves.
But that gives you an informed opinion about that one school, not how it might measure up against every other school. And I don't think there's a parent out there who doesn't want to have that ability.
They want that ability, but unfortunately, we just don't have the assessment technology to give them that answer. What we're substituting, it's like a card trick. Because we can't measure those things that we care about, that parents would care about, we start caring about what we can measure. And those things aren't always the most important things. So yes, would every parent like to not have to go into the school and compare, just like you would go compare many cars with one another, or go compare doctors, or go compare lawyers? Sure, we'd love to open our newspaper and look at a number and say, oh, good, I want to send my kid to that school. Unfortunately, education is much more complicated than that, and we can't make decisions based on such simplistic data.
I have to admit, and I think as a parent, we probably all have our own opinions, and they wouldn't necessarily align perfectly, but I have a sense of what the better schools are in Ottawa. I look at these results, and they align pretty closely to what I think. Is that just coincidence, or are they reinforcing certain biases that I have as a parent at the start?
Well, yes and no. That's a great question, because many things are true at the same time. First of all, your sense is probably correct, and that's because what you're working off of is what the socioeconomic, basically the level of wealth in that neighborhood. Generally, parents who have more political clout, who have more volunteer hours, who can donate, do fundraisers and so forth, are going to demand more of their local schools than parents who are either single parents or working 3 jobs and don't have as much pull in that community. So, yes, we know what schools are good in Ottawa because we know which neighborhoods are good in Ottawa or are wealthier. However, and this is why I said I really liked your question, it's not always the case. And this is why the Fraser Report rankings are misleading in another way. Those schools who do the top in those tests are not the best schools for all kids. Some schools are going to put a lot less emphasis on what teachers often call drill and skill and test preparation. And instead of spending months preparing for these tests to the exclusion of all other educational activities, they're going to be more focused on the business of what many educators would think of as a real education. And that's why I'd love, like you're saying, I'd love to tell parents, oh, you want to choose a school for your kid? Just read the newspaper and pick the highest ranking. It doesn't work because kids are different. There's no one solution fits all to every educational problem. And parents need to put in the time to do the work themselves to figure out which school is the best fit for their child.
And the reality is there are other factors that are impacting the outcomes here. A school that maybe attracts a higher percentage of new Canadians, English as a second language Canadians, would not fare as well in these tests and therefore wouldn't score as well, even though it may be an excellent school.
Absolutely. And, here in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Vancouver, I just visited a classroom in Vancouver that had 23 languages represented by the kids in the class. The class had 27 students in it. It's sort of mind-boggling. So, of course, those teachers are faced with obstacles that teachers in other schools aren't faced with. And the question of where your child will thrive will depend a lot of factors that depend on your child. But the main thing that we should all keep in mind is that these narrow scores of just math and literacy represent only a small fraction of what goes on in schools. And, a nice comparing example, many people are critical of the Maclean's rankings for universities. And I'm a university professor, right? I always laugh because for years, year after year after year, University of Ottawa issues statements that say, we don't pay attention to those rankings. They don't mean anything. And then a few years ago, of course, University of Ottawa rose in the ranks and they were issuing press releases. They were saying this is the best thing ever, right?
But do you think your university reacted to those results? They may not like them. They may be dismissive when the marks aren't good. Do you think they change the way they do, I hate to use the term, but the way they do business?
Well, I think they change for the worst. What happens is it's a saying that's popular in K-12 education, which is teaching to the test, right? So once universities know how these rankings are devised, they do everything they can in their power to game the system. So, for example, one of the things that these rankings use to measure how good a university is what percentage of applicants the university accepts, right? So you want that number to be as small as possible. University of Toronto only accepts, 8%. These are numbers I'm making up. Then we know it's a good university. So what did universities do, of course? Well, they started waiving the application fee for kids to apply, or they started recruiting more people to apply so that they could reject more people. So it's about gaming the system. But interestingly, and we're now into criticizing the Maclean's report. But what's interesting about the Maclean's report is, as flawed as it is, it does take into account an enormous spectrum of variables, student to faculty ratio, what campus life is like, what the climate of the school is like.
But it didn't initially. And I think it got to where it is today because there was this criticism that it's superficial, that it wasn't giving an accurate representation. Maybe the Fraser Institute can trigger that. Maybe we can develop a system where we can, because in the business world, and I'm sure it's everywhere today, maybe you hear it in academia, there's a phrase that says, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And I think there is a growing demand among Canadians that they want to be able to measure and make sure that schools measure up, teachers measure up. And I'm just staying within academia, but I mean, generally in the world, I think we look for that because the world's a complicated place and we want somebody to give us a credible ranking of just whether somebody's or something, an organization or an institution, is performing.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, I think it's a natural human inclination to want a kind of numeric measure of what goes on in the world. But unfortunately, there's lots in our world that you simply can't measure that way. We can't measure love or passion or the taste of food or all kinds of parts of the human experience. And education, despite our cultural obsession right now with standardizing it and measuring it, it's simply not simplistic enough to be able to do that with. And really, when we think of other sectors of our society, we get a sense of the kind of professionalism that we should be affording educators. So, for example, I've heard on your show, in fact, Finland often held up as the sort of, perfect education system because they do really well on those international measures of performance, right? Well, your listeners might be surprised to know that Finland has absolutely zero standardized tests from K to 12. They pay their teachers extremely well. They have high professional regard for teachers. And those are things that I think Canada would do better to focus on because teachers' teaching environments really are students' learning environments. And the best thing we as a public can do is to support those teachers as much as possible, understand them as the professionals they are, and then get the heck out of their way so that they can do their job. And these standardized tests throw shackles on what teachers try and do and prevent them from doing a good job rather than enabling them.
But do you accept there are better schools than others? There are good schools and there are less good schools.
Oh, absolutely. They are. But what I wouldn't accept is that correlates with the rankings of the Fraser Report. Now, what I do think can put, you said earlier that, how can we put pressures on schools to broaden their curriculum to cover more things that are important to us as parents and as educators. I do think that's important, and I think conversations like the one you and I are having are the best way to educate the public and talk about those issues and put pressures on schools to respond to them. Unfortunately, putting more focus or shining that street spotlight, as I said, on only two teensy, very narrow measures of school performance is counterproductive. All
right, Joel Westheimer, really appreciate you coming in. Fascinating discussion.
My pleasure, Rick. Thanks.
Joel Westheimer is the research chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa. We'll take a break.